Politics according to the Bible. Should Christians even be involved or even care about politics? No. End of class. Good. See ya. No. Theologian Dr. Wayne Grudem wrote a book several years ago with the help of my buddy Craig Ostin at ADF. Wrote a book called Politics According to the Bible. It's a thick book that you can pick up, but it's easy reading. And Dr. Grudem has spent a lot of time thinking about these things. Mom and Dad and I know Dr. Grudem. I've spent time with him. He's a real little humble guy, despite the fact that he graduated from Harvard and Cambridge, so he's no dummy. And he spent a lot of time thinking about this. And he says he has argued there are 5 unbiblical views, 5 unbiblical ways to approach this. One is theocracy, that government should compel religion. Sometimes Christian conservatives are accused of wanting to have a theocracy, where it's just we live, we just pound it in, everybody's got to be a Christian, everybody's got to live this way, and so forth and so on. And he argues that that's unbiblical because faith cannot be compelled. Faith has to be come out freely. The gospel is offered to everyone, but you have to choose whether or not to become a Christian. And so, I agree with him. Government should never try to compel religion. But number 2, government should not exclude religion. This also is both an unconstitutional and unbiblical view. Romans 13 says that all governments are established by God. God has established that government for whatever reasons that he has. Now, that does not mean that because that government has been established by God that we are always to obey it. If you remember, when Peter and the boys are in front of the Sanhedrin, what do they say to them? We must obey God, not man. So there comes a time when we are to stand up. The early Christians had this. In fact, I've argued the entire book of Revelation. People like to argue about the book of Revelation. The book of Revelation really was written to a church that's going to be persecuted by Rome because they refused to say Caesar is Lord. All Roman citizens were required to say Caesar is Lord and to give a little pinch of incense and to basically worship Caesar. And Christians said, no, we only recognize Jesus as Lord and we will not do that. In fact, there is some evidence that you could not even enter the marketplace to do business without pinching incense and saying Caesar is Lord. And then the way they proved that you had done that so you could enter the marketplace was to get a mark on your wrist or your forehead. What the early Christians called the mark of the beast, because you would worship Caesar instead of Jesus Christ. So the early Christians rebelled against that. Number 3, the third wrong view. Christians should avoid politics because all government is evil and demonic. Now, it's easy to sympathize with that, isn't it? Because goodness sake, no, stop. Not this year. Give me a break. And what people like Greg Boyd have argued this. Greg Boyd is a megachurch pastor in Minneapolis. He has argued that all government is evil and demonic because if you look at Luke 4, Satan says that he is the prince of this world. And he offers to give, remember the temptations of Jesus, he says, I'll give all the governments over to you. And Boyd said, see? They're all in his back pocket. He's the number 1 lobbyist. He's got the biggest pack. It's Satan. The problem with that is John 8:44 says Satan is a liar. Why would you base your political views on the words of Satan? That doesn't make any sense. Number 4, Christians should just focus on evangelism and discipleship and avoid everything else. Focus like a laser on evangelism and discipleship. Well, of course we should focus on evangelism and discipleship. I taught the men's Bible study yesterday. I said one of the things I said was, I don't care who gets elected this fall, unless there's a spiritual revival in this country, we're in trouble. We're in trouble. Your taxes can go down, they can go up, the military can get bigger, it can get smaller, but I'm telling you this, the heroin problem, the crime problem, that's not going away without another great awakening. That is not going to happen without the spread of Jesus Christ. So I absolutely agree, we are always to do evangelism and discipleship, but to say, Evangelism and discipleship, and you also can't think biblically about politics and approach it from a biblical point of view, is what's called a false dichotomy. It's a false choice. You can do all of those things. Now, I do tell people this. When you're trying to bring someone to Jesus Christ, worry about their politics later. If you're a right-winger and they're a Bernie Sanders fan, or you're a left-winger and they think Donald Trump is the second coming, and you're trying to get them to be baptized in the name of Jesus Christ, worry about all that stuff later. Don't just worry about that later. We focus too much when we think evangelism and discipleship means making them just like us. And you just take 5 seconds to think about the sins you've committed in the last week and ask whether or not you really want a duplicate of yourself. Don't worry about that. Don't worry about that. We are a large church. We're a church of over 1,000 people. And we have liberals, conservatives, Republicans, Democrats, independents, people who don't care. But they all love Jesus Christ. And that's where the focus always should be. There are biblical ways to think about this, but later. In fact, if Christians followed this, just avoid politics, our world would be a very different and evil place. The abolitionist movement, both in Great Britain and America, were led by Christians. People often point, we're going to talk in a minute, is America a Christian nation? One of the things people say no is because we've had such great sins, including racism and slavery. And those are indeed great sins. But the people who led the civil rights movements to end the Jim Crow laws, the sinful Jim Crow laws in the South, the people who led the abolitionist movement to abolish slavery, both here and abroad, were all Christians. William Wilberforce, ring a bell? And even though we like to talk about Dr. Martin Luther King, actually the way he referred to himself was the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. He was a Christian pastor. And it's funny, I see this all the time. Sometimes I see, let justice roll down, blah, 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 attributed to Martin Luther King. He was quoting Scripture. He was quoting Scripture. And so this is what happened. Now, if you do follow this, we'll just do whatever the government says and we'll just go along to get along. That's what the Lutheran Church did in Nazi Germany. And if you really want to read an eye-opening book, there's a book called, I believe it's called How to Kill 10 Million People. And it's a book chronicling how the church in Nazi Germany ignored what was going on. And it led to the deaths of millions of people. And the fifth wrong way to view this is focus so much on politics that you ignore evangelism and discipleship. This irritates me. First of all, let me say this again. I've said it before. Do not argue with people on Facebook. No one has ever won a debate on Facebook. Ever, 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 ever. Don't post political things on Facebook. Just leave it alone. And by the way, please, I love you all, everyone watching, but don't put something on my wall that says, if you love Jesus, like and share. That is not the test of how you get into heaven, okay? I'm not going to stand there and go, well, you had faith in me, Matt. You proclaimed my gospel. You brought people to me, brought people to faith in me. But you didn't like and share, now did you? Oh, my goodness. And this irritates me as well. As much as a political junkie as I am, and I follow all this stuff, and I have ever since I left Capitol Hill, it irritates me to see Christians more excited about a presidential election than a baptism. That irritates me. You know what? We have had good presidents, bad presidents. The country is still here. The simple fact is, you don't need to get apocalyptic. I hear this all the time. Oh, well, such and such gets elected. Folks, Have you read how the book ends? We win. Jesus returns. The kingdom is established here, and we reign with him for all of eternity. No matter who gets elected, we win. Keep that in mind. The right path is to be salt and light. Jesus Christ called all of his followers to be salt and light. Salt was a preservative. Light was to show the correct path. So to preserve a good culture and to show people the way, we need to do that in every area of life. You do not stop being a Christian when you go to work. You do not stop being a Christian when you do anything creative. You do not stop being a Christian in the political realm either. You're to be a Christian everywhere. I believe it was Abraham Kuyper who said, God looks at the entire world and everything in it and says, mine. Christ is the Lord of everything. And this is not just a New Testament concept, but a biblical concept as a whole. If you read the book of Daniel, who was Daniel? He was a political advisor to a pagan king. And in Daniel 4:27, he tells the king, follow the path of righteousness. He's telling him, follow the path of Yahweh. Old Testament, New Testament. The Apostle Paul basically preaches to the governmental rulers and tells them to be Christians and follow Christ's path. But what about America's government? I get this all the time. Is America a Christian nation? It depends what you mean by that. Has America always acted like a Christian nation? No, it hasn't. It hasn't. We've talked about this, the sins of slavery, the sins of racism. I would add to that the sin of abortion. The millions of, you could just about fill the West Coast with the babies we've aborted in this country since 1973. We have drug addiction is rampant. I mean, it's just, so if you're looking at the character of the nation as far as how the people act every day, there's no such thing as a Christian nation. Unless you populate an entire country with Jesus Christ, you're not going to get a purely Christian nation. It's not going to happen. But did the founding fathers intend it to be a Christian nation? Here's the problem. I see this all the time. You can Google this, and you will get folks from the ACLU and the folks who follow, like David Barton and Wall Builders, arguing with each other, just throwing quote back and forth. Well, Franklin said this. Well, Adam said this. Well, then Adam said this. And they go back and forth. There is a quote out there by John Adams saying this country was in no way intended to be a Christian nation. There are other quotes by other founding fathers saying, yes, it was intended to be a Christian nation. Here's the problem. You've got all these guys. We did not have a founding father. We had all kinds of them, and they all had different viewpoints. They all wrote volumes in diaries and journals and letters that we have. And here's what happens. You live long enough, you will change your mind. The founding fathers will say one thing in 1787 and something else in 1800, and people like to cherry pick and say, see. Sometimes they change their mind. That happens. That happens. And so, but here is also, something you need to keep in mind. In defining whether we're a Christian nation, if you take conservative Christians as a population, we're the minority, guys. Evangelical Christians make up about 18% of America. And that's shrinking. Because the millennials, people born between 1982 and 2000, they self-identify as Christians only in the single digits. We are losing young people The fastest growing self-identified movement in America are what called the nones. And I'm not talking about the ones with habits. I'm not talking about the ones who wear black and white. And I'm not talking about Catholic nuns. None. N-O-N-E. When they're asked what their religious affiliation is, they say none. That's the fastest growing group. There's also this myth out there, oh, if all Christians would just get out there and vote, and I'm all for Christians voting, we would have the majority, we'd have the... No, we wouldn't. How does 18% get you to the majority? 18% is not going to get you there. It is not going to get you there, which means as Christians making a biblical case, we have to be able to make the case outside of Scripture, and I believe we can, for important issues. But we are in the minority. Yet that being said, as somebody who has been a constitutional lawyer, read the Constitution back and forth, taught on the Constitution, as somebody who's read I've read the Federalist Papers many times, all that kind of stuff, looked at the evidence, read Madison's account of the constitutional debate, it is very clear that the Founding Fathers would not recognize this country. Even the most secular of the Founding Fathers would be aghast at what they see today. They would absolutely just be, what is this? For example, they guaranteed freedom of religion. Now, what the left has tried to do, the secular left, over the last decade or so, what they've tried to do is say, oh, you have freedom of worship, so you're fine. What they mean by that is, as long as you can go to church and do whatever you want to do inside those four walls of that church building, you're free. They've tried to redefine it that way. That is not what the Founding Fathers had in mind. The Founding Fathers believed you had absolute freedom of religion, which means you had the freedom to share the gospel, preach the gospel anywhere, anytime. As long as you don't do it at my lawn at 3 a.m. with a bullhorn, you have that freedom. I mean, it's amazing. Think about this. Let me ask you a question. If you had to identify the most secular Founding Fathers, least Christian of the Founding Fathers, who would you pick? Throw a couple names out there. Franklin. Benjamin Franklin would be a big one, okay? Yeah, Franklin had a rather odd view of religion. So, and just like Thomas Jefferson, Franklin believed all the miracles in the Bible were probably made up. It's just a bunch of myth, all that other kind of stuff. That being said, neither Jefferson or Franklin were atheists or even agnostics. They were not even deists. I hear this all the time. They were deists. They were not deists. They believed in God, and they believed God was active in the world. They just did not believe in miracles for whatever reason. And they didn't believe that Christianity was the only way to God. They were what we would call today liberal Christians. But Thomas Paine, on the other hand, guy born in Britain but was instrumental in the American Revolution, Thomas Paine also believed in God, but he really was a deist, and he really did not like organized religion. And he wrote a work called The Age of Reason, where he argued, we no longer need organized religion. And he sent a copy to Benjamin Franklin, asking his friend Franklin. He thought Franklin would stand up and applaud. Franklin wrote this. I'm only going to read the last part of the letter. You can find the letter online. Franklin responded to Paine this way. He said, I would advise you, therefore, not to attempt unchaining the tiger, but to burn this piece before it is seen by any other person, whereby you will save yourself a great deal of mortification by the enemies it may raise against you, and perhaps a good deal of regret and repentance. Benjamin Franklin. If men are so wicked with religion, what would they be if they were without it? I intend this letter itself as proof of my friendship, and therefore add no professions to it, but subscribe simply yours B. Franklin. Benjamin Franklin, the least religious of the Founding Fathers, said, if people are so wicked with religion, just imagine how much worse they'd be without it. Does this sound like they wanted a secular nation to you? Indeed, during the Constitutional Convention, and the Constitutional Convention was, at first, it was absolute chaos. How many of you have been to the hall in Philadelphia where they wrote that? I've been there, you guys have been there, okay. It's a little bitty place, isn't it? And it was very hot, and they did not want the press. They didn't trust the press. The Founding Fathers were smart enough not to trust the press. They did not want the press listening in on the convention, so they had all the windows and everything sealed. And it was hot as blazes in there, and things got heated. And they could not agree on a number of things. There were a lot of people, because at that time, the Constitution was not our first form of government. Our first form of government were the Articles of Confederation. But that was a disaster. So they got together and said, we got to come up with something better than that. And so they got together. But a lot of people were suspicious. They were afraid that the Constitution would give the federal government too much power. And the states wanted to keep things to themselves. And so it got pretty nasty. And so finally, at a standstill, Benjamin Franklin stood up and delivered this. I'm just going to read part of his speech. He addressed the other founding fathers this way. He said, in this situation of this assembly, groping as it were in the dark to find political truth, and scarce able to distinguish it when presented to us, how has it happened, sir, that we have not hitherto once thought of humbly applying to the Father of lights to illuminate our understandings? In the beginning of the contest with Great Britain, when we were sensible of danger, we had daily prayer in this room for divine protection. Our prayers, sir, were heard and they were graciously answered. All of us who were engaged in the struggle must have observed frequent instances of a superintending providence in our favor. To that kind providence, we owe this happy opportunity of consulting in peace on this means of establishing our future national felicity. And have we now forgotten that powerful friend? I have lived, sir, a long time, and the longer I live, the more convincing proofs I see of this truth, that God governs in the affairs of men. Does that sound like a deist to you? And if a sparrow cannot fall to the ground without his notice, is it probable that an empire can rise without his aid? We have been assured, sir, in the sacred writings, he means Scripture, that except the Lord build the house, they labor in vain that build it. I firmly believe this. And I also believe that without his concurring aid, we shall succeed in this political building no better than the builders of Babel. We shall be divided by our little partial local interests. Our projects will be confounded, and we ourselves shall become a reproach and byword down to the future ages. And what is worse, mankind may hereafter, from this unfortunate instance, despair of establishing governments by human wisdom and leave it to chance, war, and conquest. I therefore beg leave to move that henceforth prayers imploring the assistance of heaven and its blessings on our deliberations be held in this assembly every morning before we proceed to business, and that one or more clergy of the city be requested to officiate in that service. That was the request of Benjamin Franklin at the Constitutional Convention. Does that sound like they wanted to establish a secular nation? And this is the least religious of the founding fathers. So, you can argue, I don't care what you believe, whether America is a Christian nation or not. Certainly, however, the founding fathers would not recognize today the nation they established. They believed in religious liberty. They believed in a small federal government, and they believed everything else should be left to the states. Indeed, when the Capitol building was constructed, which it didn't open until about 1800, Congress kicked off its first session there with hours of prayer. Hours of prayer. And these were largely Presbyterians. There were church services held at the Capitol every Sunday morning. There were roughly, I think, 4 different services going on at the Capitol building. The U.S. Marine Band was the worship band. And Thomas Jefferson and James Madison attended at the Capitol building. Now, Madison is the man most responsible for the Constitution, and now we have people out there saying that it violates the Constitution to have a chaplain open Congress with prayer. They used to have church service there with the Marine Corps band leading praise. Are you kidding me? With James Madison sitting right there, the guy who wrote the Constitution. How far afield we have gone. Well, what kind of government did these men give us? When Franklin was exiting the hall, when they finally agreed on the Constitution, he was asked by a lady. He was in a wheelchair. He was elderly at the time. And he said, Dr. Franklin, what kind of government have you given us? And he said, a republic, ma'am, if you can keep it. Now, contrary to popular opinion, America is not a democracy. We are a republic. There is a difference. A democracy, you vote on everything. Do you really want to vote on every single issue? Do we really have to get every citizen in a hall and poll them when we want to change the name of a post office in Jackson, Wyoming? I don't think so. A republic is you elect people to vote for you. We are a republic, not a democracy. This is one of my biggest pet peeves. Stephen Breyer, one of the most liberal justices on the U.S. Supreme Court, wrote a book on the Constitution several years ago. I've read it a couple times. And Justice Breyer says the way you interpret the Constitution is to promote democracy. Now, there's a problem with that. We're not a democracy. We're a republic. Now, I understand what he means, but one, he has absolutely nothing to base that on but his own opinion. The Founding Fathers don't state that. In fact, the Founding Fathers were probably a little suspicious of democracy. You could not, and in their vision, and I'm not saying this is right, but this is what, you could not even vote unless you owned property. And the reasoning behind that was they were afraid that if people could vote and they were unemployed and they didn't have a stake in the system, they would only elect people who would raid the treasury for them. The Founding Fathers saw this a long time ago. A long time ago. And again, I hear this all the time. We need to raise taxes, we need to cut the military, whatever. And maybe they're right, maybe they're wrong. Our biggest spending problem is entitlements. And Social Security, I'll give Trump this, he's right about this. Social Security's going broke, folks. It's going broke. It was a system designed for people only for people who outlived the typical age. When they set the retirement age at 65, most people were lucky to live to 60. And so it was considered support for the very elderly and who could no longer work. Well, now, I mean, all due respect, my parents are collecting Social Security and they work 60 hours a week. But they saw that. Here's the reason why, because you can ask, okay, all right, Matt, so what? Okay, the Founding Fathers, that's the government they gave us, but so what? They're a bunch of dead white racists. I mean, a bunch of them owned slaves, for goodness sakes. A couple of them had fast zippers, as my dad likes to say. Franklin and Jefferson definitely did. They needed some of that religion. Now, the kind of government they gave us was only based on incredible research and study. The Founding Fathers spent decades studying different governmental systems. They studied the Roman Republic. They studied the Greek democracies. They looked at what was going on in France. They considered this very carefully. These were men who read and spoke several languages, were classically educated, and did this for no gain of their own. They were flawed men, to be sure. I would not want to leave a young girl alone with Thomas Jefferson or Benjamin Franklin. But they were wise when it came to government. Just because a person is flawed in one area of life does not mean they don't know what's going on in another area of life. And you need to keep that in mind. I mean, think about this. Some of our most effective presidents have been people you wouldn't leave your daughter with. Would you leave your daughter with JFK? No, you wouldn't. FDR had a mistress. Eisenhower had a mistress. And you can know how to get things done and still be a jerk. Richard Nixon got a lot done, but goodness sakes. Though ironically, Only two men between 1933 and 1974 who were in the Oval Office were ever faithful to their wives. One was Harry Truman, and the other one was Richard Nixon. Who would have thought that? Now, my mom says that's because he's too ugly for anybody to want to sleep with, but anyway, that's... But, you know, isn't that odd? I mean, you can have these leaders, and quite frankly, if you just look on the record, and I'm being quite serious here, the three most liberal presidents we have had over the last 60 years have been FDR, LBJ, and Richard Nixon. The old joke in Washington was LBJ started the Great Society, Nixon funded it. And so party means almost nothing, but you can know a lot. And Richard Nixon was brilliant when it came to foreign affairs. He really was. He had an encyclopedic mind when it came to foreign affairs. And so, you know, he would have made a great Secretary of State. He was just a lousy president. You can be an expert in one area and be flawed, badly flawed in all others. One of the problems Hillary Clinton has, quite frankly, is she lives in the shadow of her husband, who's one of the best politicians I've ever seen. He was a great speech maker, and he was great on the trail. Typically, you don't get both of those. Ronald Reagan was not a not good campaigner one-on-one, but he was a great speaker. Barack Obama, great speaker, not great one-on-one. As long as he's got his teleprompter, he does a very good job. Bill Clinton had that rare gift of having both. He was really good one-on-one. He would take you by the hand, and he'd look you in the eye, and he'd sit there, and you'd think, I'm the only guy in the world. I'm the only person in the world to this guy. Look at that. He would have that, and then he'd go on TV. I remember when I worked on Capitol Hill, and just to be transparent, I worked for a Republican, and we had the majority in the House, and I remember going to a meeting that Newt Gingrich was leading when we had the budget fight in '95 where the government shut down. And Gingrich said, he wants to go to war, we're going to war. I'm like, okay, I'm sitting there thinking, okay, Newt Gingrich and Bob Dole on TV versus Bill Clinton. Oh yeah, this will go well. Yeah. It did not go well. Bill Clinton went on TV, almost teared up, and the next thing I know, I got a pile of letters on my desk like this calling me fascist, Nazi, scum, I mean, you name it. And so, you know, people can be very skilled in one area and be very flawed in another. Bill Clinton is another person who I wouldn't leave my daughter with. But if you were looking for somebody to get things done, he got things done. And so the founders had their flaws. They were deeply flawed, but they knew government. They knew government. And the Constitution they wrote, and if you've never read the Constitution, you need to read the Constitution. It will not take you that long. It's not that long. It's not that complicated. And you're going to be shocked at what you find. One of the things you're going to find is the Founding Fathers gave the government only a very narrow area of authority, and they said, stick here, otherwise it belongs to the states. It's none of your business. And it's being violated left and right. We get these people that get elected to office, they put their hands up and say they will defend and protect the Constitution, and then they ignore it their entire time they're in office.
And why is that happening?
Hold on, we'll get there. If you read through the Constitution and you read through like the Federalist Papers, which was the popular defense of the Constitution, you will see that basically the Founding Fathers set up an adversarial system where it was very difficult to get anything done by design. The President was to represent the interests of the nation as a whole. The Senate was to represent the interests of the states as a whole. And the House was to represent the interests of the people as a whole. When you think about that, that means they're going like this. It was by design. When this whole Trump thing was happening and you had the Trump rallies where people getting hurt and all that kind of stuff, George Will said this anger. He said, I hear this all the time. He said, nothing's getting done. He said, well, nothing's getting done. He said, your problem is not with Congress. Your problem is with James Madison because he designed it that way. Madison designed it so nothing would get done. He did not want the federal government to have that much power, and he wanted to move slowly. And so that only when the national interest, the state interest, the interest of the individuals all together could agree could you get something done. That's how it was designed. They did not want to have the federal government have a whole lot of power. They were very wary of any government becoming too powerful. State, local, federal, they did not want any government to have too much power. If you read through the Constitution, which I hope you'll do this week, you will see that basically the federal government was given the authority to negotiate treaties with foreign nations, to raise an army and navy when necessary. You can argue from the Constitution that they didn't even want a standing army or navy, only to call one up through the state militias when necessary. To set tariffs to pay for the government. Tariffs are what you put on imports and exports, kind of tax going in and out. And to pay for the military, and not much more than that. They didn't want the government to do much more than that, the federal government. The rest was left to the states. Article 1, Section 4, Clause 2, Article 1 deals with Congress. It says, the Congress shall assemble at least once in every year, and such meeting shall be on the first Monday in December, unless they shall by law appoint a different day, which they often do. Now, this is what's funny. When this clause was debated, and here's why. Two of the founders are on record. Governor Morris and Rufus King, these are two of the men at the Constitutional Convention, believed that yearly meetings were not necessary for Congress because there wouldn't be enough for them to do. I'm not kidding. They actually debated whether or not Congress people should be paid because they wouldn't be there that often anyway. This is how far afield we've gone. There was a popular notion bandied around by Congress that was actually implemented in the first couple of years where they were only paid traveling expenses. They were basically paid mileage. And the only reason they ended up paying them was because they didn't want only the rich people to run. But they really believed, this was hotly debated. They were like, they need to get together every year. Why? They don't have that much to do. Because they didn't give them that much authority. Exactly. We have gone far. It's difficult to even know how many people the federal government employs today. The estimates are somewhere above 1.5 million. But we don't even know because we have so many people are contracted, so we don't know. I want that to sink in for a second. The federal government cannot accurately tell you how many people it employs. It's that big. Federal regulations put out by bureaucracies, which is unconstitutional in itself, because that's basically legislation being written by an unelected official, now number more than 81,000 pages. Federal regulations number 81,000 pages. The Cato Institute did a study, and they say that on average, your average small business person commits 3 felonies a year that they're completely unaware of because of the number of federal regulations. Mm-hmm. Yep. And regulatory lawyers, believe it or not, there are lawyers who specialize in trying to understand federal regulations. They do nothing but that. And I have seen them interviewed where they said, I tell people all the time, most of the time I have to say, I don't know. Because I can't memorize 81,000 pages, no one can. And often the regulations contradict themselves. And I don't know, do I pick this regulation or this one? I don't know how to comply. But this is what happens. Does anybody, I don't care what your political leanings are you going to tell me that's fair? To have so many laws that we can't even understand and we don't even know when we break them? It's just unreal how far we've gone. I saw one stand-up comedian say this. It's funny. He said, you think you're free? You really think you're free? You need a license to cut hair. Goodness sakes, they regulate how you cut hair. It's unreal. That's why I want you to read the Constitution this week. And I want you to, that's your homework, read the Constitution. And you're going to be absolutely amazed at how different our federal government is from what it was designed to be. Now, the kind of big structure is still there, thankfully, but it's not anywhere near what it was. I used to have a boss that he asked me this. He asked me, Matt, have you ever been to Mexico? I said, yeah, I lived in Southern California. When you're 18 in Southern California, Mexico is where you go to party because you can drink when you're 18 in Mexico, so heck yeah. And he said, well, let me ask something. He said, what's the big difference? Because there's a big difference. I mean, the moment you cross the border, there's a big difference. The difference isn't the culture. The culture of Southern California and Southern Arizona and Southern New Mexico and Southern Texas is not that different from the culture in Mexico. So why is one side so wealthy and one side so poor? The only difference is the system of government. The system of government is the difference. And if we want poor people to be prosperous, well then, we need to stick to a system of government that works. And the system of government the founders gave us, I'm going to argue, is flawed, but still the best one on the face of the earth. It's flawed to be sure. You're never going to get a perfect court system. You're just not. It's not going to happen. I tell people all the time. I used to tell clients. They get mad and go, we're going to trial. I said, no, we're not. We need to settle. Why? I said, do you really want to put your life in the hands of 12 people who are too stupid to get out of jury duty? Because anybody's got any brains tries to get out of jury duty. And it's real easy to get out of. Here's a hint. You want to know how to get out of jury duty? When the lawyers ask you a question, end every answer with, in accordance with the prophecy. In accordance with the prophecy. You just say that over and over again, there's not a lawyer's going to allow you on a jury. Not going to happen. Mr. Rawlings, were you born in 1972? Yes, in accordance with the prophecy. Okay, I need your seat. Happens every time. I'm not kidding you. I've seen this happen. The Apostle Paul in Philippians 4:8 challenged all Christians to think about whatever is right and good. And I'm going to ask you this week to read the Constitution and think about what is right and good in there. There were a lot of evil things in there that fortunately we have changed, like slavery, like who gets to vote. Fortunately, those things have been changed by amendment. And by the way, when you read the Constitution, it's very clear. The only way you're allowed to change the Constitution is by amendment, popular amendment. It has to be voted on. The Supreme Court has basically taken that into their own hands. They have changed the Constitution. For example, in the ruling on same-sex marriage, if you'll read Justice Roberts' dissent, he says, look, you can celebrate equality, you can celebrate, he said, but don't say this is Constitution because the Constitution has nothing to do with this. And he's right.
Wasn't the amendment process put in place because things like slavery that they disagreed upon so that it could be addressed?
Sure. And they hoped it would. And in fact, Franklin, Jefferson, those people who weren't even religious but were abolitionists, they believed that slavery was on the way out anyway. At that time, slaves were very expensive. It wasn't very profitable to have slaves at that time because the cotton gin hadn't been invented yet. The cotton gin is what made slavery profitable and what kept it going. But at the time, the founding fathers thought, this is going to be gone in 10 years anyway. It's all right, we'll keep the Southerners, happy, and we'll go ahead and go with it for now. It's going to go bye-bye. And they believed an amendment would be passed at some point. But it has been seriously twisted, just twisted all out of proportion over the last 100 years. It all really started after the Civil War, and as all bad things do, they come out of Harvard Law School. Harvard Law School led that charge to basically try to train lawyers to be judges that twisted the law into whatever area they wanted. It was basically the idea, John Dewey and others said, we secular liberals, we know the truth, so we just need to make sure we get it through by any means necessary. And that's how it started. It came out of Harvard Law School, and it's just been infecting the system ever since. And it really took hold shortly after FDR was elected president, you started to get progressives on the Supreme Court that began to twist the Constitution. And I'm just going to, and if nothing else, I want you to read the Constitution. We'll talk more about this next week, but you think about this. The reason the Founding Fathers made the Constitution so simple to understand was that all people could understand the law very simply. The moment judges begin to ignore the Constitution and simply follow their own political bias, do you even know what the law is? Do you have any idea what's going to happen when you show up in court? Is that fair? Is that just? Of course not. Of course not. It just doesn't work. So we're going to look, starting next week, look at specific issues that the Bible addresses. And I'm going to try to be really fair, especially when it comes to economic issues, because I understand where liberals are coming from when they say, look, what about the poor? What about the... I get that. I mean, all of us drive around these streets and we see people in desperate situations, and you have to be just cold-hearted not to want to help them. And so we will look at those issues. Let me recommend a couple books. Like I said, I've tried to read as widely as I could from both the left and the right. I'm not a Fox News guy. I actually watch MSNBC in the morning, so I watch Morning Joe every morning. So don't sit there. I'm sure there are already people on Facebook just claiming I'm some right-wing kook, but I don't listen to Rush Limbaugh. I can't stand the guy, to be honest. He yells too much for me. And so I don't watch Sean Hannity. I don't do any of that kind of stuff. I do read a lot. And these two books I would recommend. This is the first one. If you really want to understand the Constitution, The Heritage Guide to the Constitution is the best book. It's a handy-dandy reference. And by the way, you don't have to buy this. It's online for free. You just put Heritage Guide to the Constitution, and the PDF version is online for free. And you can read the Constitution, and then you can click on and read the article and commentary on it where scholars have commented on how it was originally intended to be interpreted. So the Heritage Guide to the Constitution, that's online for free. My favorite history, and this is sad, we just don't know our history anymore, and that's one of the reasons why we're in such trouble. My favorite is this, A Patriot's History of the United States by Larry Schweikart. He's a professor at the University of Dayton. And Patriot's History of the United States is very well done. Now, there are other really good history books out there. Paul Johnson's book is very good. But Johnson's a little sketchy on the Founding Fathers on a couple things. I disagree with him. It's better written than Schweikart, but Schweikart's book, I think, gets the Founding Fathers better. So A Patriot's History of the United States. Now, before anybody online goes crazy, yes, I've read Howard Zinn's A People's History. I've read all that stuff, but Zinn's wrong. So anyway.
Christ Community meets on Saturday at 5 p.m. and Sunday at 10:30 a.m. For more information, visit www.christcommunity.net or check out our Facebook page.